In the stifling heat of Putnam County, Georgia, summer 1847, a widowed plantation mistress named Margaret Thornwell made a decision that would shock even the brutal standards of antebellum society. Her husband had died 6 months earlier, leaving her with a failing plantation, mounting debts, and 5 unmarried daughters ranging in age from 17 to 28. Margaret had watched for decades as white men on neighboring plantations systematically raped enslaved women and sold their own mixed-race children as property. She had seen how this brutality enriched white men while destroying black families, and she decided to reverse the equation. Margaret Thornwell selected the strongest, most intelligent enslaved man on her property, a 29-year-old blacksmith named Joshua, and made him an offer that defied every social boundary of 1847, Georgia. Father children, with each of her 5 daughters, in exchange for freedom, land, and the promise that their children would never be enslaved. What happened over the next 8 years would create a hidden bloodline that challenges everything we think we know about plantation society, maternal power, racial categories, and family structure in the antebellum South. This is the story of how one white woman weaponized the very system designed to oppress black people, how 5 sisters participated in their mother's transgressive plan, and how the children born from this arrangement would spend 170 years fighting to be acknowledged by the white family that created them. Margaret Thornwell was 51 years old in 1847, a widow of 6 months trying to manage Thornwell Plantation's 1,200 acres and 143 enslaved people alone. Her husband Edmund had died in January 1847 from pneumonia, leaving behind debts that threatened to force the sale of the entire property. Margaret faced the prospect of losing everything, becoming dependent on male relatives who would absorb her property and dismiss her authority, watching her 5 daughters married off to men who viewed them as breeding stock and economic assets. Margaret Thornwell was educated, intelligent, and radicalized by 30 years of watching slavery's sexual violence from the inside. She had watched Edmund rape enslaved women throughout their marriage. She had watched him sell his own mixed-race children without hesitation. She had watched the hypocrisy of white men who claimed racial superiority while constantly crossing the very boundaries they claimed were sacred and inviolable. And Margaret had developed what can only be described as a systematic critique of how slavery's sexual economy operated. White men could rape enslaved women and profit from selling the children. White men could create mixed-race offspring and maintain absolute power over them. White men controlled reproduction, inheritance, and genetic legacy in ways that enriched them while destroying black families. Margaret decided to flip the script entirely. Her 5 daughters were trapped in the same system that trapped her. Catherine was 28, unmarried by choice after refusing multiple suitors she found intellectually inferior. Sarah was 25, sharp-minded and bitter about the constraints of Southern womanhood. Elizabeth was 23, quiet but observant, watching how marriage destroyed women's identities. Rachel was 20, passionate and angry about injustice she saw but couldn't articulate. The youngest, Mary, was 17, still naive about the full horror of the world she inhabited but beginning to understand. None of them wanted traditional marriage. All of them understood that marriage would erase their identities, transfer them as property from father to husband, force them into endless childbearing that would probably kill them before age 40. They had watched their mother become a ghost in her own marriage, had seen how even wealthy white women were prisoners in gilded cages. Margaret gathered her 5 daughters in the Plantation House library in March 1847, 2 months after Edmund's death. She closed the doors, stationed a trusted enslaved woman named Ruth outside to ensure privacy, and presented her plan with the clinical precision of someone who had thought through every angle. "We are facing financial ruin," Margaret began without preamble. "Your father's debts total $8,000. We have 12 months before creditors can force sale of this plantation. I have a solution that will secure our future, but it requires your cooperation and your silence." The 5 sisters exchanged glances, uncertain what their mother was proposing. Margaret continued, "For 30 years, I have watched your father and every man in this county rape enslaved women and profit from selling their own children. They maintain absolute control over reproduction, genetics, and inheritance. They use enslaved people's bodies as resources to extract wealth. This is accepted practice. This is how the system operates. She paused, letting her words settle. I propose we do the same thing, but we will do it differently. We will do it with purpose, consent, and planning that serves our interests, rather than destroying families. The room was silent. The daughters were beginning to understand something impossible was being suggested. Joshua, our blacksmith, is 29 years old, Margaret said. He is the strongest, most intelligent man on this property. He is literate, skilled, and has qualities that would benefit any bloodline. I propose that each of you will bear children fathered by Joshua. These children will be mixed race, which means they will be classified as property under Georgia law. We will raise them on this plantation, educate them secretly, train them in valuable skills. When they reach adulthood, we will manumit them, provide them with resources, and help them establish lives as free people. The silence stretched longer. Catherine, the eldest, found her voice first. You're proposing we participate in a breeding program using an enslaved man. I'm proposing we use the same system white men have used for 200 years, Margaret corrected. But with crucial differences. Joshua will consent. He will be compensated with eventual freedom and land. Your children will be raised with love, education, and a path to freedom. No families will be separated. No children will be sold. This is not the same as what white men do when they rape enslaved women and sell their own offspring. Sarah, 25, spoke next. And what happens when this becomes public? When people discover we've borne children with an enslaved black man? We'll be destroyed socially. Probably institutionalized as insane. Which is why it cannot become public until long after it's accomplished, Margaret said. Each of you will take extended trips to our coastal property when pregnant, citing health reasons. You will give birth there attended only by trusted enslaved midwives. The children will be brought back as orphans acquired from other properties. Georgia law allows us to own enslaved children without documenting their specific parentage. We will maintain absolute secrecy about the children's mothers and father. Elizabeth, 23, asked the question that mattered most. Has Joshua agreed to this? I haven't asked him yet, Margaret admitted, because I needed to know if you five would consider it first. If you all refuse, there's no point in approaching Joshua. Rachel, 20, was shaking her head. This is insane. This is participating in the same horror we claim to hate. No, Margaret said sharply. Horror is what Edmund did. Horror is rape, sale of children, destruction of families. What I'm proposing is a transaction with clear terms, consent from all parties, and an outcome that creates freedom rather than bondage. Yes, we would own Joshua's children for a period of years, but we would be working toward their emancipation from birth. That is not the same thing. Mary, 17 and the youngest, spoke for the first time. What does Joshua get out of this? Why would he agree? Margaret pulled out a document she had drafted. Freedom for himself after the last child is born. 20 acres of land purchased in his name in Ohio, where slavery is illegal. Sufficient money to establish a livelihood. Legal guarantee that all his children will be manumitted when they reach age 18. This contract will be witnessed and notarized, binding on this family even after my death. She looked at each daughter in turn. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm asking you to think about what your alternatives are. Marriage to men who will own you as surely as we own enslaved people. Childbearing that will destroy your bodies for husband's economic benefit. Or participation in a plan that, yes, uses the system's own logic against it, but does so with consent, compensation, and a goal of creating freedom. The discussions that followed over the next 3 weeks would later be documented in Catherine's private journals, discovered in 1923 and eventually archived at the Georgia Historical Society. The 5 sisters struggled with the profound moral complexity of what their mother proposed. It was exploitation dressed up as liberation. It was using an enslaved man's body for reproduction, while claiming it was different from what white men did because there would be consent and compensation. It was participating in the very system they claimed to oppose. But they were also trapped. Marriage meant legal death as independent beings. Refusing marriage meant poverty and dependence on male relatives who would treat them as burdens. Their mother's plan offered a third option that was horrifying but pragmatic. One by one, the daughters agreed. Catherine first, coldly pragmatic about survival. Then Sarah, attracted to the radical subversion of flipping slavery's sexual economy. Elizabeth agreed reluctantly, seeing no better options. Rachel agreed while crying, knowing she was compromising everything she believed. Mary, the youngest, agreed last, still not fully understanding what she was consenting to. Margaret approached Joshua in April 1847 with her proposal. The conversation took place in the blacksmith shop where Joshua worked, not in the main house where the power dynamic would be more obvious. Margaret brought the written contract, the promise of freedom and land, and the full explanation of what she was asking. Joshua's reaction was documented in testimony he gave decades later in 1891 when he was 73 years old, interviewed by a northern journalist researching slavery's legacy. Joshua's words were recorded. "Mrs. Thornwell came to me with the craziest proposal I'd ever heard. She wanted me to father children with each of her 5 daughters. She had a contract, promising me freedom, land, and money after it was done. She said the children would be freed when they turned 18. She said I could refuse, and nothing bad would happen to me." The journalist asked, "Did you believe her that you could refuse without consequence?" Joshua's answer, "No, I was enslaved. She owned me. She could have had me whipped, sold, killed. When your owner asks you to do something, you don't really have the power to say no." She called it a proposal. "I understood it was an order dressed up as a choice." "Did you sign the contract?" "Yes, because even though I knew it was exploitation, it was also the only path to freedom I was ever going to get. And because she promised my children wouldn't be enslaved permanently. I'd watched masters sell their own mixed-race children south without blinking. Mrs. Thornwell promised that wouldn't happen. I gambled that she meant it. What do you think about it now, looking back? I think it was wrong, and I participated in something wrong. But I also think I got free because of it, and my children got free, and we built lives we never could have built otherwise. Can both things be true? I don't know. I'm an old man who's been free for 44 years because I fathered children with 5 white women who owned me. You tell me what that means." The arrangement began in summer 1847. Catherine, the eldest at 28, was first. She was sent to Joshua's cabin on a predetermined night, an encounter orchestrated by her mother. What happened in that cabin was documented only obliquely in Catherine's journals, but the emotional content is clear. Shame, duty, detachment, and a deliberate suppression of any human connection with Joshua. Catherine wrote, "I accomplished what Mother required. I did not speak to him beyond necessary acknowledgments. I cannot think of him as fully human, or I will break apart understanding what we are doing. I must think of this as necessary transaction or I cannot proceed." Catherine became pregnant in August 1847. She was sent to the family's coastal property in McIntosh County with the excuse of seeking sea air for her health. She gave birth to a son in May 1848, naming him Thomas. The baby was light-skinned, showing his mixed heritage, but ambiguous enough to be claimed as an orphan acquired from elsewhere. Thomas was brought to Thornwell Plantation and absorbed into the enslaved population, though his treatment was noticeably different from other enslaved children. He lived in better quarters, received better food, and was kept close to the main house from infancy. Sarah, 25, went to Joshua's cabin next in September 1847. Her pregnancy resulted in a daughter, Ruth, born in June 1848. Elizabeth, 23, followed in January 1848, giving birth to a son named Samuel in October 1848. Rachel, 20, began the process in May 1848, bearing a daughter named Grace in February 1849. Mary, 17 when this began, went to Joshua's cabin in September 1848 and gave birth to twin boys, Daniel and Isaac, in June 1849. By summer 1849, Margaret Thornwell's plan had produced 6 children, 4 boys, Thomas, Samuel, Daniel, Isaac, and 2 girls, Ruth, Grace. All were mixed-race children of Joshua and the 5 Thornwell daughters. All were legally enslaved by the Thornwell family, and all were being raised with the secret knowledge that they would be freed at 18. The plantation's enslaved community understood immediately what was happening. The physical resemblances between Joshua and the children were unmistakable. The special treatment the children received confirmed suspicions. But no one spoke this knowledge aloud because acknowledging it openly would bring devastating consequences for everyone involved. White neighbors noticed that the Thornwell daughters remained mysteriously unmarried, despite being prime marriageable age. They noticed that Margaret Thornwell seemed to acquire enslaved children with unusual frequency. They noticed that several of these children bore striking resemblances to Joshua. Rumors circulated quietly, but no one confronted the Thornwells directly because accusing white women of sexual relationships with enslaved men was socially taboo and legally dangerous. Margaret Thornwell managed this impossible situation through a combination of strategic isolation, financial independence, and ruthless control of information. She limited social interactions with neighboring plantations. She cultivated a reputation as an eccentric widow, managing her property unconventionally, but successfully. She ensured that the Thornwell daughters presented as pious, modest, unmarried women devoted to helping their widowed mother. And critically, Margaret made Thornwell Plantation profitable. She had Joshua train the enslaved workforce in skilled trades beyond agricultural labor. She diversified crop production. She eliminated the wasteful cruelty that characterized most plantations, understanding that brutality decreased productivity. By 1850, Thornwell Plantation was one of the most profitable operations in Putnam County, which bought Margaret social tolerance for her eccentricities. The 6 children born from Margaret's arrangement grew up in a strange twilight existence. They were legally enslaved, classified as property in Georgia law. But they were secretly the grandchildren and children of the women who owned them. They received education that was illegal for enslaved people. They were taught to read, write, calculate, and think critically. They understood from early childhood that they were part of an experiment with promised freedom at the end. Thomas, the eldest, born May 1848, understood by age 7 that he was Catherine's son and Joshua's son, even though he couldn't openly acknowledge either relationship. He understood he was enslaved by his own mother. The psychological complexity of this reality shaped every aspect of his childhood and identity. Ruth, born June 1848 to Sarah, experienced the same impossible duality. Her mother owned her as property while secretly planning her eventual freedom. How does a child process that reality? Samuel, Daniel, Isaac, and Grace all grew up navigating this same psychological minefield. They were enslaved children who knew they were actually grandchildren of the plantation mistress. They worked alongside other enslaved children who didn't have promises of future freedom. They watched their fathers, Joshua, who treated them with distant kindness, but couldn't openly claim them. Hit that subscribe button right now if you're not already subscribed. Because what I'm about to tell you about what happened when these children reached 18 years old will show you how broken and complicated the path from slavery to freedom actually was. We document suppressed history from primary sources every Saturday at 2 p.m. EST. Turn on notifications because next week we're revealing how plantation families used genealogical fraud to erase mixed-race children from family records entirely.
In 1855, when Thomas reached age 7 and the youngest twins were 6 years old, Margaret Thornwell fulfilled the first part of her contract with Joshua. He was legally manumitted, granted free black status in Georgia through paperwork that claimed he had purchased his own freedom with saved wages. This fiction allowed the manumission to proceed without raising questions about why Margaret would free her most valuable skilled laborer. Joshua was provided with money, supplies, and instructions to travel to Ohio, where he would receive the 20 acres of land Margaret had purchased in his name through intermediaries. The land transfer had been arranged years earlier, waiting for this moment. The day Joshua left Thornwell Plantation in October 1855 was documented in Catherine's journal. Joshua departed today for Ohio. Mother gave him $300, clothing, travel papers showing his free status, and the deed to land in Marietta. He said goodbye to his children without being able to name them as his children. Thomas watched him leave with an expression I cannot describe. My son watching his father abandon him, except it isn't abandonment, it's freedom. But Thomas is 7 years old and cannot understand that distinction. I have made my child understand he is enslaved by me. What have I done? Joshua established himself in Marietta, Ohio, on the 20 acres Margaret had provided. He worked as a blacksmith, slowly building a life as a free black man in a free state. And he waited for his children to reach age 18 so they could join him. Thomas reached 18 in May 1866, just after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished throughout the United States. The timing meant Thomas was freed not by Margaret's private arrangement, but by the 13th Amendment. The manumission Margaret had promised became unnecessary because all enslaved people were freed by constitutional decree. But Margaret honored her commitment anyway. She provided Thomas with money, clothes, travel arrangements, and his father's address in Ohio. Thomas left Thornwell Plantation in June 1866, traveling to Marietta to meet the father he barely remembered from childhood. The reunion between Joshua and Thomas was documented in letters. Thomas wrote to his mother Catherine, letters she saved and which survive in her archived papers. Thomas wrote, "I met my father today. He is 53 years old now, a free man for 11 years. He wept when he saw me. He asked about you, about his other children, about whether we all survived the war. I told him everyone is alive. I told him I'm angry. I'm angry at him for leaving us even though I understand. He had no choice. I'm angry at you for owning me, even though I understand you planned to free me. I'm angry at the system that made all of this necessary." He said he understands. He said he's angry too. He said we have to decide if we can build something new or if the anger will consume us. Over the next 5 years, as each of Joshua's children reached 18, they made the journey to Ohio. Ruth arrived in 1866, Samuel in 1866, Grace in 1867, the twins Daniel and Isaac in 1867. By 1867, all 6 children had reunited with their father in Marietta, Ohio. They established a family compound on Joshua's property. The 6 siblings built houses. They married free black people from Ohio communities. They had children, Joshua's grandchildren, born into freedom, and they struggled with the profound psychological complexity of their origins. They were children of enslaved father and white mothers. They were grandchildren of a white woman who owned them as property while planning their freedom. Exploitation dressed as liberation. They carried genetic material from both sides of slavery's racial divide, embodying the very mixture that white supremacy claimed was impossible and dangerous. The Thornwell daughters never married. Catherine, Sarah, Elizabeth, Rachel, and Mary lived together on Thornwell Plantation with their mother until Margaret's death in 1872. After Margaret died, the 5 sisters continued managing the property together. An unmarried sisterhood that scandalized but was tolerated because they were wealthy and white. The sisters maintained correspondence with their mixed-race children in Ohio, letters that survive in family archives. Catherine wrote to Thomas regularly until her death in 1891. The letters show a woman struggling with guilt, defensiveness, and genuine love for a son she owned as property for 18 years. In one letter from 1878, Catherine wrote, "I know you believe I am a hypocrite for claiming to love you while owning you. You are correct. I am a hypocrite. I participated in a system I claim to oppose. I told myself it was different because we planned your freedom, but you experienced enslavement regardless of my intentions. I cannot undo what I did. I can only tell you that I grieve the choices I made, and I am grateful you survived them." Thomas's response, "I don't know how to forgive you. I don't know if I should forgive you. You gave me life and you owned me. You educated me and you could have sold me. You loved me and you participated in my bondage. All of these things are true simultaneously. I am building a life in freedom. My children will never know slavery. That is because of decisions you made, but it's also despite decisions you made. I don't know what our relationship is, but I won't pretend you are simply my mother when you were also my owner." The 6 mixed-race children of Joshua and the Thornwell daughters built successful lives in Ohio. Thomas became a teacher, educating formerly enslaved people and their children. Ruth married and raised 8 children. Samuel established a carpentry business. Grace became a midwife serving black communities. The twins Daniel and Isaac purchased land and farmed together, creating generational wealth for their descendants. But they also faced the reality that white society would never fully accept them, and black society often viewed them with suspicion because of their white ancestry and relatively privileged upbringing. They existed in a liminal space, neither fully white nor fully black, in a society that demanded everyone be classified as one or the other. Joshua died in 1891 at age 73, surrounded by his 6 children, 23 grandchildren, and 9 great-grandchildren. His obituary in the Marietta newspaper identified him as a respected freedman and skilled blacksmith, but made no mention of his children's unusual parentage or the arrangement that had brought him to Ohio. Margaret Thornwell died in 1872 at age 76. Her will, probated in Putnam County, Georgia, made no mention of her 6 mixed-race grandchildren in Ohio. Legally, they didn't exist as her descendants. The Thornwell plantation property was divided among her 5 daughters, who continued living there together until the last sister, Mary, died in 1904. The secret of the Thornwell breeding arrangement was maintained for decades after everyone directly involved was dead. The mixed-race Ohio branch of the family preserved oral histories about their origins, but these were dismissed by historians as unlikely or exaggerated. The white Georgia branch of the family, descendants of the Thornwell sisters' siblings, denied any connection to mixed-race families, claiming Thornwell ancestry. In 1923, Catherine Thornwell's private journals were discovered during renovation of the old Thornwell house. The journals documented the entire arrangement in Catherine's precise handwriting. Her mother's proposal, her own participation, her conflicted feelings, her correspondence with her son Thomas. The journals were donated to the Georgia Historical Society, where they remained largely ignored for 80 years. In 2003, descendants of Thomas, Ruth, Samuel, Grace, Daniel, and Isaac initiated DNA testing to prove their connection to the Thornwell family. They provided genetic samples and requested samples from descendants of the Thornwell sisters' white relatives. The white Thornwell descendants initially refused, claiming the whole story was fabricated despite Catherine's journals. But in 2008, one white descendant, a woman named Margaret Thornwell Harrison, agreed to testing. She had become interested in family history and wanted to know the truth. The DNA results were conclusive. The mixed-race descendants of Joshua's 6 children carried genetic markers, proving they were related to Margaret Thornwell Harrison through the Thornwell sisters. The testing confirmed that Joshua's children were biologically the children of Catherine, Sarah, Elizabeth, Rachel, and Mary Thornwell. The revelation created crisis in the white Thornwell family. Some members accepted the connection and reached out to their mixed-race cousins. Others denied the results despite scientific evidence. Some claimed their ancestors had been victims of assault rather than participants in Margaret's planned arrangement, rewriting history to preserve white female innocence. In 2011, descendants of both branches of the family held a joint reunion in Marietta, Ohio, on land that had been Joshua's original 20 acres. Over 400 people attended, connected by blood through an arrangement made 164 years earlier in Georgia. In 1847, Margaret Thornwell made an arrangement with an enslaved man named Joshua that resulted in 6 children born to her 5 daughters. These children were legally enslaved but promised eventual freedom. Freedom. They were products of a system that dehumanized everyone it touched. Joshua's children established this free community in 1866. We honor them, Joshua, Thomas, Ruth, Samuel, Grace, Daniel, and Isaac, who built lives in freedom from impossibly complicated origins. We acknowledge the Thornwell women, Margaret, Catherine, Sarah, Elizabeth, Rachel, and Mary, whose choices cannot be simplified as either liberation or exploitation because they were both. Before you leave, do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel. We're documenting suppressed slavery history that reveals how complicated, how brutal, and how impossible to categorize these experiences actually were. Second, turn on notifications so you see new videos every Saturday at 2 p.m. EST. Third, share this video with someone who thinks slavery was a simple story of villains and victims, because the truth is far more complex and disturbing. Next week, we're documenting how plantation owners used systematic genealogical fraud to erase mixed-race children from family records, changing birth dates, omitting names from family Bibles, falsifying parentage to maintain white racial purity. We have original documents showing the fraud and DNA evidence proving what they tried to hide. This is the story of Margaret Thornwell, her 5 daughters, an enslaved man named Joshua, and the 6 children born from an arrangement that defied categorization. Was it exploitation? Was it liberation? Partially. Was it resistance to slavery's logic or participation in slavery's brutality? Both. Can people be victims and perpetrators simultaneously? This story says yes. These are the stories they tried to bury because they complicate narratives we want to be simple. Digging them up.